Hi, I'm Ruban Selvanayagam from Property Solvers Auctions. In this video, I want to tackle a question that comes up a lot in our day-to-day, and one that many sellers misunderstand until they actually go through the process. What happens if the winning bidder pulls out after an auction? It's a fair question because auction sales are often assumed to be final, yet the consequences of a buyer failing to proceed aren't always clearly understood from the outset. Let's dive straight in. Just before we get into the detail, it's worth saying up front, what happens after a buyer wins an auction depends heavily on the type of auction you're using. In traditional or unconditional auctions, the seller's legal position is extremely strong. The moment the hammer falls, the buyer is locked into a binding contract. In the modern method of auction, often run by estate agents and auction houses such as ourselves, the buyer has less to lose and more freedom to walk away. We'll come back to that distinction shortly, but let's start with the traditional process first, because that's the foundation of how true auction law works in England and Wales. Unlike private treaty sales where buyers can drift, delay or disappear, traditional auction sales are governed by very clear legislation and contractual rules. So here's the legal underpinning. Under long-established auction law, a binding contract is formed at the fall of the hammer, within the statutory framework set out in legislation such as Section 57, subsection 2 of the Law of Property Act 1925. Section 2 of the Law of Property Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1989 confirms that a property contract must be in writing and signed, satisfied through the memorandum of sale signed immediately after the auction. And there are the standard conditions of sale, 5th edition, and widely used common auction conditions or CACs, which formalise deposit requirements, contract formation, completion dates, interest charges, and remedies for default. We'll have the links to the relevant legislation in the show notes. Now, some buyers don't realise that the law treats a successful bid as an immediate exchange of contracts. There's no cooling off period, no renegotiation, and no subject to survey. That's why auction offers more certainty than the estate agency sales, because the commitment happens at the very start, not months into the process. So what does this legally binding exchange mean in practice? At the fall of the hammer, the buyer must pay the 10% deposit immediately, must complete within a specified time frame, usually 28 days, but this can vary. The buyer becomes liable for any breach under standard conditions and the seller's special conditions. And if the buyer tries to pull out, delays too long, or simply fails to complete, the consequences are pretty straightforward. The deposit is forfeited, i.e. released to the seller, contractual interest begins to accrue, a notice to complete is issued, the seller can claim additional costs, losses and damages, and the property can be relisted quickly. This is the strongest buyer commitment framework of any mainstream property sale method in the UK. Now let's bring the modern method of auction back into the conversation, because this is where many sellers get confused. In modern method or conditional auctions, the buyer doesn't exchange contracts when the hammer falls. Instead, they pay a non-refundable reservation fee, often 3 to 5% plus VAT, sometimes more. They then get an exclusivity period, typically 56 days, to exchange and complete. And here's the critical legal difference. Until contracts are exchanged, there's no binding agreement for the sale of the property as required under Section 2 of the 1989 Act. So if the buyer walks away, they do lose the reservation fee of 3 to 5% or more, but they don't forfeit a 10% deposit. They're not contractually obliged to buy. They're not being chased for damages or resale losses, and they can simply walk away within the exclusivity window. So modern method increases buyer participation but decreases seller security. Traditional auction maximises legal certainty but requires more serious, better prepared bidders. And going back to traditional auctions, if a buyer fails to complete on the contractual completion date, typically 28 days, the seller is not required to terminate the contract immediately. Under the standard conditions of sale, 5th edition, and the common auction conditions or CACs, the seller is entitled to serve a notice to complete, which gives the buyer a short additional period to complete on the sale. However, and this point is often misunderstood, interest is automatically charged for every day completion is delayed beyond the contractual date. This isn't discretionary, it's expressly provided for under the standard conditions, which are themselves enforceable under contract law following the exchange or auction, an exchange that is legally recognised under Section 57, subsection 2 of the Law of Property Act 1925. Once the hammer falls, the contract exists. Once the completion date passes, the buyer is in default. From that moment, daily contractual interest accrues until completion takes place or the contract is terminated. This creates immediate financial pressure on the buyer to resolve funding, legal or logistical issues quickly. Delays are not neutral, they are costly and they can escalate every day. If the buyer still fails to complete, the seller then has two clear and practical routes forward. First is rapid relisting. Because the legal pack, photography and marketing materials are already prepared, the property can then be re-entered into the next auction cycle quickly. Many sellers achieve a similar price again, in some cases a higher one. The other is an immediate sale to a committed cash investor. At Property Solvers Auctions, we maintain a network of pre-vetted purchasers who can step in quickly when a defaulting buyer forces a fast solution. Either way, the seller retains the deposit, minus any agreed fees, benefits from accrued contractual interest during any delay, and doesn't return to square one. unlike estate agency fall-throughs where months are often lost and the process has to begin again. So what's the overarching message here? Auction law is incredibly clear, long established and designed to protect sellers. Under the relevant legislation and conditions, traditional auction means immediate exchange, full legal commitment and financial liability for default. And for modern method auctions, there's the reservation fee to be paid at the fall of the hammer, softer protections and a higher fall-through risk, but it's still arguably a better option relative to an estate agency sale. When it comes to traditional or unconditional auctions, buyers cannot simply pull out. They're contractually bound and financially exposed the moment the hammer falls. Modern method buyers, by contrast, have far more flexibility, which is why the model attracts larger buyer pools but delivers somewhat weaker legal certainty. Understanding this difference is crucial when deciding how to sell, especially if timing, risk and legal security matter. If you would like a breakdown of which auction route is best for your situation, and a fully evidence-based valuation report aligned with risk principles, actual sold data and buyer behaviour, feel free to email me at ruben@propertysolvers.co.uk. We'd be delighted to help you plan a secure, transparent and well-structured auction sale. A big thanks for watching.